Hello, I'm Daniel Shin, and welcome to Discussion on Christianity and Law with the Dean. So, Dean, today you really went full in with respect to how Paul engages in arguments, which is very different from what we did last semester. But it's very interesting in your approach of taking what I think many of us would be accustomed to, trying to trickle out exactly what the scientific arguments are, but you took a different approach. So could you tell us a little bit about what you think is happening with what Paul's trying to do in this letter to the Galatians?
So we're looking at Galatians 2 today, and the basic questions were twofold. We're lawyers, we use rhetoric, we use techniques of persuasion, and there are people who suggest that's bad, and that we should only argue sort of in scientific ways. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was to look at this letter and to say, what does Paul do? And Galatians 1 and 2 are rhetorically very, very rich. It's a very powerful introduction to the wonderful message of Galatians that our salvation is by faith and not by works. But Paul begins with this long introduction to the source of his gospel, that it came directly from God and was not a result of being taught by others, because he wants to build up the credibility of his teaching. And even while doing that, he throws in some nice insinuations. He's telling this story about how he didn't get the gospel from the Jews in Jerusalem, but he did go there. And oh, by the way, he took a Gentile once, and he wasn't required to be circumcised, which is the big issue in Galatia. Do you have to be circumcised? So he's using a lot of rhetorical art, and so we review some of that, which ends in Galatians 2 with this great confrontation with Peter. And Paul comes up with some very nice pithy arguments as he depicts his confrontation with Peter. He exposes the contradiction of Peter's position, but it's just clear, I think, if you read this, I hope if you listen to the lecture, that Paul is doing what we're doing. He's using the same techniques and practices. And as we talked about a little bit today, and we're going to advance through the course, nevertheless, he does something different. This is the second point. There is a sense in which he feels responsible in everything that he does and say to understand how it links back to his faith in Jesus Christ. And one of the things that we want to meditate on this semester is in our legal rhetoric, in different circumstances. How can we nevertheless be knowing Jesus Christ in all the ways that we speak?
You mentioned the part about the confrontation with Peter, but in the lecture you also try to qualify it as it could have also been a word of encouragement. So in that sense, I think there's a richness that comes out with looking at it from Paul making an argument rather than a scientific approach to ceremonial laws or Jewish laws. So could you go and kind of introduce us to that part with how he engages with Peter?
Yeah, at the end of the second chapter of Galatians, Paul describes he says he confronted Peter to his face. And I tried reading it two different ways in class. One in a way that I thought invited Peter to argue back, kind of roughly, leaning very heavily just on the logic and compulsive force of the argument. And one that came to me as I was studying in Galatians 6, Paul says, when you correct a brother, restore him gently. And I don't mean that determines the question, but it got me to go back and read that passage gently. As Paul knows Peter's a giant of faith, but he also has a tendency, and when he gets afraid, to abandon Christ. And I read it now, he's confronting him to his face, but with gentleness. Peter, you're a Jew. You know what the law can and can't do. How being a Jew, could you make Gentiles live like that?
Mm-hmm.
You didn't come to faith. You didn't come to salvation through obeying the law. You came through faith in Jesus Christ. Why would we rebuild what Christ has torn down from us, the death of the law? And I can just imagine a lot of responses Peter would make if he had argued roughly. And so I think he was restoring his brother gently now.
Well, if you are very interested into seeing how Paul engages in argumentations through this chapter in Galatians, please go and look at the full lecture, and we look forward to further reflections on Paul's arguments through his epistles.
I think it's going to be a good semester.
Well, thank you, Dean.
Thank you.